If you've been paying close attention to my videos, you may have picked up on the fact that I have some weird daddy issues going on. His overbearing father had no idea how to be supportive, and Clay ended up with mental health problems. Gee, wonder what that's like.
But really all we see of that is Julia telling her to sweep before a guest arrives and to keep her shoes off the bed. If that's supposed to be overbearing, then sorry, Dad, but I have no choice but to go put on a Halloween costume and rob a bank.
Also mommy issues. I have been playing for about half an hour, and I get to this point. My mother, the most puritanical pastor's wife of a woman that you could possibly imagine, is passing through the living room. You probably like that she's dressed that way. Hey, Mother. What the Now, I want to make it very clear. While I do have quite the novel relationship with my upbringing, and thus can feel free to express these experiences however I damn well please since I am a grown-ass man with the mental capacity to mock my own traumas, none of this is because my parents weren't trying to love me in their own ways. Today's game really is a great example of that. At that point in my young life, we really only had games that could run on Dad's Mac, and they absolutely had opposed me having any degree of gaming system by that point in my life. Probably worried about too many sexy games on the Game Boy Color or something. But my parents really stepped up to make it very special when they got me Lego Star Wars, the video game. Dad borrowed a projector and screen from the church he was preacher man at and hooked up the Mac to it for a few days so I could have a larger-than-life first-time experience with it. It was a genuinely thoughtful and loving introduction to my first real game. I also have a distinct memory a few days later. Dad was like, "Sure, you can play one level this evening," and so I started up Droid Factory, and I was so excited to add R2-D2 to my roster since I'd been stumped by the pod race and Phantom Menace doesn't give him in any levels until Retake the Palace. But then maybe I was a third of the way into the level at most, and Dad got impatient, perhaps thinking it would have been like playing a round of Galaga, which takes 2 minutes when he permitted it, and then his expectations were wrong, so he just kicked me off of there and I lost all of my progress on that attempt. As I come to think of it, this was sort of commonplace behavior, like when I really wanted to make brick films as a kid, and so my younger sibling and I were making one where the classic yellow minifig version of Harry Potter accidentally turns Ron into a birthday cake, but my father got impatient for some unclear reason and kicked us off of the camera we needed to shoot the thing, so we just never got to finish our project. He wasn't even using the camera. What the fuck was that all about? The relevant point present somewhere in this tangent is that Lego Star Wars wasn't just the first formative Lego adaptation game, it was also my first formative video game. And if it weren't for that one, who knows where I'd otherwise be on this domino chain covering games on YouTube decades later. I've not been shy about this influential title. I first elaborated on all this in my video years ago, 8 games that emotionally fucked me up, which makes sense in context, I assure you. And I most recently alluded to some of this in last week's episode, too. Side note, don't tell my Assassin's Creed viewers that I actually got 2 videos released this fast. They've already threatened to unionize on me, and I just cannot afford the kind of havoc wrought by people already used to being backstabbed by Ubisoft. So today we're deep diving into Lego Star Wars the video game, the 2005 title that began this whole shindig. Please do the like and comment routine that tickles the algorithm's fancy. Subscribe and hit the bell if you're inclined to go a step further and keep up with new videos. And if you're feeling real frisky, you can support my Patreon for as low as $1 a month. And without further ado, this is a briefish history of the Lego Adaptation Games. Turn back the clock 20 years to the day of releasing this video, Natch, to March 29th, 2005. Despite some rocky reception to the first 2 entries in the prequel trilogy, hype for Revenge of the Sith was in full swing. Lego was making a big deal about it, with some sets even containing special edition light-up lightsaber minifigures. I saved up to buy the big, expensive clone turbo tank with Mace Windu, who was my favorite Jedi as a kid. His blade basically had to be translucent pink to allow the light to shine through, and then it just looks blue. 10 out of 10, no complaints. With all of this building excitement, it was a clear time to strike while the iron was hot and release Lego Star Wars, the video game, based on all 3 Star Wars prequel films. 2 months before Revenge of the Sith actually came out. People just did not give a flippin' fuck about spoilers back then for some reason. The full movie novelization was out just a few days later, with the normal Revenge of the Sith game also out earlier in the same month as the movie. This was nothing new to Star Wars, considering that the Phantom Menace soundtrack showed track titles in advance of that movie's release, spoiling that Qui-Gon Jinn would take it deeper in his guts than even your dad can manage 4 margaritas in. To Traveler's Tales, this probably felt routine. They were the kind of dev that people hired to make licensed games. They brainstormed reasonable specifics of what both Lego and Star Wars could reflect in gameplay, and they casually dropped a goddamn masterpiece, something obvious enough at an early enough point in development that Giant Interactive glommed onto them in a merger, becoming TT Games, securing the future for more of these. I brief-ishly covered that history in the last episode. There's no need to get bogged down here, other than just talking about the general landscape from whence this emerged. This was the latter end of the 6th generation of home consoles, or the PS2, Sega Dreamcast, original Xbox, and the Nintendo GameCube, if you don't speak old man gamer. The Dreamcast had already crashed and burned by this point, but this version of Lego Star Wars, the video game, was on everything else, plus PC and Mac, so it represents this era quite well. That also includes having a weird Game Boy Advance port, very common back then, and something I have already covered if you are so inclined to watch that next. The 3D action platformer was all the rage at this point, and these systems were saturated with them. Dripping. A lot of them were not good, such as VeggieTales, Larry Boy, and the Bad Apple, which is emblematic of the bad side of the spectrum, and is something else I have already covered, if you are so inclined to watch that next after the other one you are watching next now. Thank you for queuing up my backlog so diligently. Odin will reward you when you reach Valhalla. LSW, having not emerged from a vacuum, does carry some inspiration from the good platformers of the day, with collectathon sensibilities not unlike Insomniac's platformers, such as the Ratchet & Clank trilogy from the recent prior years, whose own smashing of crates to collect currency seems just too similar to not have had any influence. And as far as the first entry in a series goes, this one has comparatively a lot of the familiar elements in place right at the outset. It's not every element, but compare it to my other brief-ish history series. Batman Arkham definitely owes a number of broader franchise elements to Arkham City, which you can notice missing looking back at Asylum in hindsight, and Assassin's Creed really owes a ton of its broader elements to its second game as well. Now sure, those first games were medium trailblazers in a way Lego Star Wars was not trying to be, so I guess someone sufficiently motivated to be lazier could take a moral from all of this about excelling by doing less. But I am far too insecure to dare make people draw a connection between laziness and Baneshake, and so we'll move on suspiciously abruptly. One interesting angle to keep in mind before we get into the meaty potatoes here is the concept of Abandonware. If you're unfamiliar with the term, Abandonware is, broadly speaking, software that is no longer available to purchase from the people who have the legal power to distribute it, i.e., it ain't on any storefronts cause they ain't selling it when they could. This kind of thing, unfortunately, does happen all the time. It's common enough with my other series that I have a running gag implying that the Templars, or Calendar Man, have actually brought down whatever relevant spin-off game or feature is now missing for their own nefarious schemes. It's not all that often for TT's Lego games, though. Sometimes games would get digitally delisted because of licensing ending, but that's a bit different, as they could no longer sell those legally. But even those have a knack for popping back up again thanks to renewed licensing. The most that we typically see go away for good is very minor additional content packs. The fact that I've gone this into detail about details should imply where I'm going here. Lego Star Wars, the video game, is not really available for sale anywhere in its distinct form unless you're buying a used copy. I sort of get why, compared to a lot of Abandonware, since a relatively close approximate version of this content is also available in the Complete Sagas compilation, but it's not one-to-one, and I always err on the side of game preservation, so I hate that TT hasn't at least listed this version for a couple of bucks over on GOG or something. Now, I still own my original Mac copy. I have jumped through the relevant hoops as our capitalist overlords arbitrarily demand. The corporation got paid, and the meaningless line of ownership has not been crossed into abandonment. I can still physically touch my goddamn game. That being said, this version of the software cannot run on modern Mac hardware, and so I had to figure out playing different versions anyway. I'm pretty sure there is a SWAT team already on the way after me. I really hope I don't get violently killed off yet again at the end of an episode of A Briefish History. As far as Abandonware goes, this one will be relatively accessible to normal players, as emulating several of the original consoles is easier than ever before. However, that footage is less pretty, especially with the PS2 version looking relatively long in the tooth. I wanted good footage. When I've covered some of the Lego handheld ports, I settled for the acceptable but not mind-blowing console footage my cheap AF capture card can handle, since those bits aren't the main focus of those, but I did so through gritted teeth. Briefish History deserves better though, so I figured out running the PC version. And boy howdy, does running PC Abandonware from 2005 really highlight both the pros and cons of PC gaming. Pro, it is unambiguously prettier, mission accomplished. One loyal viewer was perhaps justifiably distraught at the forced widescreen caused by modern hardware when I uploaded a teaser for this project in January, but after considerable consideration, I have had to make the call that this was more than sufficient for this console plebeian's standards, considering the alternatives and all of the upcoming cons list. If you are a more capable PC gaming purist than me, as my apology, you can leave an outdated graphics card under your pillow, and I will have the PC Gaming Fairy leave a Starbucks gift card with $7.54 in its place for you. Don't ask where the rest of the money went. I definitely drink normal adult coffee that doesn't have to masquerade as a milkshake to be palatable. As for those cons, oh boy, is it technically rough after years lacking support. Right off the bat, you have to have the final update patch installed for the game to launch at all, but my game kept losing, forgetting the update, so I kept having to reinstall it. There were a noticeable number of crashes along the way, technically still not unheard of for lots of games, but the baffling flip side to that is that if the game runs too well, it can create issues. You have to cap it at 60 frames per second, because if it goes above that, characters start losing jump height. One strange softlock, which still occurred long after capping the frame rate, saw one room teleporting me back to the prior directly upon entry. Though after a few attempts and a couple of resets, I was able to tag another party member in the nanoseconds I had available to proceed. Another time, I thought I was softlocked out of a minikit when I used the force and only one single brick for the build moved. But I am patient, so I waited, and turns out the rest were, in fact, moving. Just in Zack Snyder mode. Certain textured surfaces, typically Lego built for extra irony, exhibited collision issues that inconsistently disliked letting me jump, and C-3PO, who cannot jump, couldn't clear the lip of one platform unless it was already in motion, which took some trial and error and another reset when he got stranded alone out of tagging distance. I don't want this all to just sound like I'm bitching. Again, I wholeheartedly think this was worth the extra efforts for this video. I would do it all again in a heartbeat for my purposes. I just know not everyone just looking to play a game wants to tolerate so many shenanigans and may be happier with the smoother experience on other systems. TT, for real, you get this on good old games or Steam with the support it needs, and I will be first in line to pay for the convenience that would bring. Enough of all that. Let's look at what this game actually brought to the table. The game drops you directly into Dexter's Diner, our main hub housing the store and the levels, as Qui-Gon Jinn and Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi. While not the most iconic or necessarily relevant location from the prequels, I get why they picked it for this purpose. The infrastructure, as it were, fills every niche appropriately. A parking lot to show off minikit models, a convenient shopkeeper in Dexter, who does use his limited screen time in Attack of the Clones to showcase his streetwise knowledge that translates well for this role, even if he is missing his mustache here, and restaurant paraphernalia makes for varied and logical interactables like drink machines and condiment shakers that explode with the relevant particle effects, and a jukebox that plays the opening to the series' classic jizz music, their word, not mine. Even without those, the retrofuturism of the design just provides a nice shiny place that is fun to be in. In the movie, it may have felt slightly perplexingly 1950s Americana in juxtaposition to what we otherwise usually see from locales, but that visual variety only benefits here. Choosing the diner also helps temper expectations ahead of time. Sure, something like the Jedi Temple perhaps might have been more iconic, but that would also need to be a massive and sprawling hub to not feel a little disappointing. And then, it would also be redundant with content within the levels too. That all being said, I do think it gets a bit silly when you start buying separatist characters and the parking lot becomes a war zone. Everyone coexists peacefully inside, so going out only to witness a child get gunned down in cold blood feels out of place. There are 18 levels total, semi-evenly distributed between movies. The Phantom Menace and Revenge of the Sith both get 6, with Attack of the Clones slightly lacking with only 5. There were clear time restraints preventing Traveler's Tales from completing one rather obvious omission from that film. The final bonus level is only unlocked by completing the Super Kit. See, in this original game, filling the True Jedi stud meter for each level was incentivized by giving pieces towards a more elaborate build in its own special section of the lot. Do all that 17 times for the super secret... Okay, look, it's obviously one for A New Hope, teasing the second game. I played this game so young and at such a formative age that my brain keeps trying to arbitrarily categorize this under spoilers because of how much of a welcome surprise this was in my first ever game, but this should not have been a surprise at all. The store silhouettes make it obvious Princess Leia's in the game thanks to her iconic buns, and the Super Kit is pretty clearly the Tantive 4, even well before it is completed. This is also the most obvious place for a 2005 Star Wars game to go next for as yet not covered material in chronological order. I was not a smart child. Combat, while simple, is engaging enough and has worthwhile attention to detail. Lightsaber combat has standard strikes, a forward lunge attack off of one jump, and a larger area of effect slam attack after a double jump. These three have different speeds, and the distinct utilities are all useful at different times. Correctly timing standard attacks will actually also give benefit to the few enemies with enough hit points that it matters, which it indicates by making your saber sparkle and you do more damage. Pressing attack right before a blaster bolt hits you deflects it directly back to the enemy that shot it, and the Force can also push back some enemies for a mid-range option for the relevant characters. Blasters are comparatively simpler. firing with auto-aim in the general direction the character is facing, though firing up is inconsistent if you don't jump first. Blaster characters also cannot melee in this game. Standard enemies go down in 1 hit, with commanders requiring 2 hits, super battle droids requiring 3, and droidicas, thanks to their shields, can take several hits from their own bolts or a lightsaber, before also taking several hits to the body to be destroyed, though a ground slam or a sparkly combo will remove the shield faster. If you are using a blaster character and a destroyer pops out, you better be fast, because you can only take them down while they are vulnerable and rolling. One level even gives the most elite enemies, driving AT-RT walkers, and those take several hits, to say the least. There are no other combat styles per se, but there are a few more combat elements. Astromechs can use their hacking arm thingy to temporarily stun droids, though you will have to switch to someone else to finish the job. Enemies will not target service droids, nor will battle droids attack other battle droids. Playing as a droidica breaks that whole arrangement, as they hate all and are hated by all, and their rage cannot be quenched. Surprisingly, there are also a noticeable handful of characters with no means of attack. Most glaringly, the children, who again enemies are more than happy to slaughter in cold blood without hesitation. Player 2 will dive into the middle of a fight, but quite pathetically does no damage when controlled by AI. So sometimes I would accidentally whale away on them because they stepped in front of my attacks, I swear, officer. Puzzles do veer on the simpler side, even by franchise norms, but they make up for it somewhat just because there is a lot of novel unpredictability as you work on them. Sometimes it's unique little sound effects as you do things. And sometimes it's an entire goddamn bicycle you weren't expecting to pop out of that plant. But the sense of exploration and wonder helps to keep things feeling fresh. This game manages to project the feeling that there are secrets tucked into every nook and cranny, even when you consciously have a grasp on what elements will and won't actually hold secrets. This game hides only the 10 minikits, each in levels, lacking any other collectible, as the extras are all for sale by default from the store. And though as a complete novice child gamer, it took me a few attempts to find everything, these are particularly simple to find. Sometimes you'll find a minikit on one side of a doorway where the camera couldn't originally see, and then the other one is just on the other side. Another time, there's just one floating above a second in the same spot. Some of these are even possible to cheese out earlier than intended. Like in the arena, you're supposed to build the column and then use a Sith in free play to build stairs going up to it. You can get it as early as story mode, as you can also just take the top of the column back down and reach it with the range a mere Jedi can jump to. At least as far as puzzle difficulty goes, it was certainly a perfect starting game for young moi, but I am glad the series got a bit more elaborate from here. There is something of a respectable quaintness to the design that I certainly find nostalgically charming. It's not just the lack of certain gameplay features or flourishes, like how True Jedi doesn't really announce itself with any crazy fanfare, it just sort of calmly happens. This game is a great time capsule. Some of these designs and some of these builds go straight back to Lego Star Wars Foundation in 1999, like the classic backwards megaphone blasters, or how some characters are just whipping out cowboy revolvers since they didn't have more specialized pieces yet. This does mean some of the vehicles and whatnot are unbelievably alien if you only know the greebling and the complexity of sets nowadays, but that just makes it a blast to revisit. That or I'm old. Could just be that I'm old now. Am I old, viewer? You can tell me if I'm old. I can handle it. The roster consists of 56 playable characters to use in these levels, alongside a handful of non-playable characters, mostly in cutscenes. While that might seem meager by modern series standards, I think it's still a pretty good starting representation of the prequel cast of characters. It is remarkably light on the specific ability classes, though. There are Jedi who have a double jump and can move things or build things with the Force. The Force automatically highlights a nearby object for you to interact with, which means sometimes it is a pain to highlight what you want when several things are in close proximity, but it's typically fine. The Force is actually the only way to build here, by the way. The bouncing piles of bricks that indicate something can be built did not exist yet, which is wild in hindsight considering how heavily later games use the feature. Next class is the Sith, who function the same way as Jedi, but have a few specific dark side exclusive Force interactables. The hints claim they are black objects, but in truth they are any combination of black, red, and grey. Some literally don't even have any black to them at all. I want my 50 studs back. Then there are blaster characters who can shoot targets and can use built-in grappling hooks. Except battle droids sort of have to be broken off into their own class away from the other blaster characters, since they can only hit targets lacking grappling hooks, or jumping at all, in this 3D platformer. Then there are the Super Jumpers, Jar Jar Binks, General Grievous, and his Magna Guards, which the game merely calls Grievous Bodyguards. These three even have higher jumps than Jedi and Sith. Some small characters can fit through vents to pop out of a different location. And by some I mean two, Kid Anakin and Kid Boba Fett. Yoda cannot, despite more or less doing that exact thing in Revenge of the Sith, and PK droids, despite being both the smallest characters in the game and designed to do maintenance and repair work, also cannot. Since Anakin perplexingly has adult length legs while Boba has the age-appropriate short legs piece, it's clearly not a size thing. It's clearly a child labor thing. Oh my god, the libertarians have infiltrated Lego Star Wars. Astromechs have unique access panels and a massively nerfed version of R2's jet attachments, which merely hover a short distance instead of letting him Superman around the place, murdering foes in burning infernos. Protocol droids are remarkably more pedestrian, only having their own unique access panels, though they do also amusingly lose a limb each time you abuse them. Outside of class abilities, there are technically a couple of other functions. There is Flight, where Jango Fett and the Geonosians stay in the air after jumping for as long as you please. However, mobility is the only real utility here, as they do have to stay above solid ground. Anything more than jump distance across a gap and they will just fall to their deaths, making the skill somehow weaker than astromech hovering. Commander battle droids can also, at will, pull out a walkie-talkie and say, "Roger, Roger." This does nothing. I love it so much. One element that does apply to the entire roster is the famous, rather mimetic death noises, which were taken from sound effects the characters use in moments of peril or pain in the films. Some of these get very silly very fast, to the point I wonder how I was supposed to take them seriously in live action in the first place. For funsies, I'm going to scrutinize these 56 characters in the roster. Even though I literally not once ever complained about the bunch as a child, I do now think there are a few clear omissions. Despite the number of cutscene characters properly modeled and with plausible gameplay similarities to existing characters, quite a few are unplayable, like non-Jar Jar Gungans and Watto, although it's plausible few people are itching to play as a slave owner, and those that are should probably not be in your social circles. Though I would say Jedi are represented well with several appropriately representative prequel-era members. Plo Koon and Ayla Secura would have rounded out this handful thoroughly had they been included. Episode 2 clones are represented by only one generic trooper, lacking any variants like pilots or commanding officers, and while Episode 3 clones have several versions thanks to their abundance in the physical sets that year, the Kashyyyk Trooper, which is one of my absolute favorite minifigures from early Lego Star Wars, somehow got overlooked. Zam Wesell, to fit with her missing scene, is nowhere around, and that feels like insult on top of injury. Like, they included the Gonk droid and weren't even willing to make her a generic blaster character. Battle droids have pretty good rep for Episode 1 and 3 with standard, commander, and security versions, but yet again, Episode 2 versions are shafted. All of the Geonosian-made battle droids in that film use a differently hued material, and though we do see standard troops reflect this, higher ranks do not. It's weird seeing only the palest droids here getting promoted over their regional counterparts. Oh god, I've stumbled onto some weird droid racial hierarchy, haven't I? I sure hope that doesn't get a callback in some future video. Separatist leadership, who in the movies mostly stand around or run away or get murdered by Anakin and do very little worthwhile, are simply nowhere to be seen. Because they knew I would cancel them for their weird droid racism, the freaking libertarians. There are also a handful of character mistakes I am aware of, too, thanks to either not matching their movie equivalents or their character icons. Though correct in the console versions, here Obi-Wan is missing his Padawan braid. His droid, R4P17, should have a fully red dome with silver accents going around it, but instead is a recolor of R2-D2 with the blue swapped for red. This does match a physical minifigure from 2005, included with the ARC 170 fighter, but that one was never supposed to be R4 in the first place. Commander battle droids would be more accurate with yellow accents merely on the body, also seen on their icon, but have yellow bodies, which then have large amounts of tan accents so that the smaller yellow accents on the chest can actually be seen. Last but perhaps most beneficially, the Swamp clone, which is supposed to be green per the icon and the physical minifigure, is somehow blue, giving some resemblance to the 501st Legion, which I consider an absolute win. You want some numbers for the playable cast? Compared against only the physical minifigures available by 2005, only 23, or a rounded 41% of the playable roster, had an exact, as presented here, real-life toy, if you are as strict as possible when comparing. Now, that ends up a little misleading for several reasons. For one, LEGO had barely started doing realistic flesh tones when Revenge of the Sith released, so the prior Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones dudes, who should be realistic human colors, had only been released in the available classic yellow. For two, LEGO wasn't printing eyes on the specialized molded heads yet, whereas Traveler's Tales made the 100% correct call to give said minifigures distinct eyes so they wouldn't look weird, while inconsistently not doing that for Geonosians. Genuinely cannot explain what happened there. Then, for 3, a few characters were special edition light-up lightsaber versions to celebrate the movie, and though most were available as normal minifigs through other sets, or in Mace's case just through later editions of the same set, Luminara Unduli never got one, making her purely luminous unduly. I will not apologize for that play on words. I could have been even stricter and not counted any battle droids since they all only had sideways arms to hold guns thug style back then instead of the upright positions seen here. But since we're already seeing animations bend and move in ways a fig realistically cannot, that felt too arbitrary of a line to draw, even by these other metrics. So if you count close enough equivalents accounting for these 3 factors, forgiving the minor errors too, that number jumps to a much better count of 40 available in sets, or a rounded 71%. Moving on over to the extras, this selection is certainly an interesting first attempt at these. Several of these, and I do mean several, are for replacing weapons with alternate versions, which does sadly mean several of these cannot stack. Blasters get 3. Big Blaster puts an orange cone piece on the end, technically something a couple of early sets did too. Classic Blaster uses a piece from LEGO's own 1970s space theme. And Silly Blaster, gives some extra girth to the tip. Kinda like my buddy Wes. That is also not a build that would work in real life. Weirdly, while these extras will work on Wookiee bowcasters, they bizarrely won't work on Battle Droid or Geonosian blasters for no clear reason. Teacups replace lightsabers and blasters with the classic blue cup piece, which still function just as lethally as before. Brushes replace lightsabers with push brooms, and can actually stack with those blaster extras. Darth Maul even gets a double-sided broom for good measure. There is also purple, turning all lightsabers and force effects purple, because having a cool purple lightsaber was the dopest shit back in 2005. It technically still is to this day, but we've had more time to get used to it in the intervening years. Silhouettes is an odd one, turning characters, as it sounds, into completely black silhouettes, in case you wanted to play around with your sleep paralysis demons for a bit. Mustaches give everyone a big, gray, stylized mustache, which is weirdly not visible at all angles, and sort of appears to sit weirdly high on some characters' faces, even though I technically know it's not in the wrong location. There are even a couple with actual utility. Invincibility keeps you from taking combat damage and prevents money loss if you fall into fatal hazards, though you are still staggered by hits which will interrupt the Force. It costs a whopping 1 million studs, but it is well worthwhile here, as it will make certain free-play minikits, some of the trickier true Jedi levels, and just general replaying less of a pain in the ass. There is also a minikit detector, but this version kind of sucks. Mostly, it just adds a blinking arrow over the minikits, but that can be misleading when it's blinking through walls in the wrong room. It does literally nothing of note if one is particularly high up or out of the way where you won't see the arrow, and while it probably can help a little if you're really just stumped on a few, it's not worth the also high cost of 750,000 studs. And while it is unfair to hold the improvements of later games as detractions against this one, any seasoned LEGO gamer is going to genuinely miss the innovations that were fast build or the stud multipliers here. Speaking of, let's talk about my first complaint, and that is that this first attempt at the economy isn't quite where it needs to be, at least on this playthrough. Perhaps it is balanced a touch better for a young kid playing very inefficiently, which is a fair consideration. For the most part, buying characters isn't too bad. Some high-demand options like Jango Fett or Sheev are relatively expensive at 65,000 or 150,000 respectively, but there are plenty of desirable options at only 20 or 30,000 too. Some characters are only a few hundred. However, the extras all start getting much more ridiculously priced, and so, even accounting for factors like True Jedi or that completed minikit models give something like 50,000 extra studs, there was a much higher total available to purchase than the stud count I earned playing naturally, and I was going back and smashing everything, even in free play, to try and lessen the misbalance. There are a couple of options to grind money more efficiently. The opening of Mustafar's level has a collapsing corridor which doesn't penalize you for death, so you can redo it over and over to collect the studs it drops. I find this kind of grinding a bit boring after a few rounds though. Thankfully, the bonus A New Hope level drops money generously, perhaps since it lacks any other collectibles. Playing thoroughly will give you around 140,000 studs for 20 minutes effort, and you can make that a more efficient nearly 100,000 studs in only half the time if you just run through and get the quickest studs. So it was only like an hour and a half extra grinding to buy everything I needed to reach 100%. Only. Yes, I have reviewed games for Baneshake which had a shorter playtime than the time purely needed to grind here. As for my second complaint, I don't really have that solid of a second complaint. At least not anything that would be fair to level at Traveler's Tales leading up to release in 2005 that I've not already said. Sure, there were a buttload of technical issues now, but it ran great on my Mac as a kid. Yeah, there were quibbles for the roster, but this is already so much more than we get in most licensed titles generally, and with a lot of love and care and attention to detail. There are several different animation styles amongst Jedi and Sith, not just counting for Darth Maul's double saber. Sheev even gets his silly little twirl as a lunge attack. They didn't have to go that hard, but hell yeah, they did it anyway. and Magna Guards lose their heads before their last hit, both as enemies and playably, just to acknowledge the scene in Revenge of the Sith where Obi-Wan decapitates one and it keeps attacking. Running around, seeing all of these delightful characters as John Williams' perfect music serenades us, appreciating how each episode's relevant room in the diner gets slowly darker and dingier as you play through chronologically to match the rise of evil in the franchise, it really is just all so perfect of an experience that, yeah, no second complaint here. I suspect that a whole bunch of you know just how hard I was punking you there. There is a second complaint. It's glaringly large, and it's the goddamn vehicle levels. That bit about playing through chronologically, I bet there were very few children who were successfully able to beat this game in the right fucking order, and it's all because of those things. There are only 3, 1 per episode, but these are notoriously much harder than any of the rest of the game, especially the first 2. As a kid, I was stumped at the pod race, and stumped at Gunship Cavalry for some time. The battle over Coruscant that opens Revenge of the Sith did briefly prevent me from getting into that content the first time I ever played, but it was much easier finally besting that one. So my original episode completion order was Episode 3, Episode 1, Episode 2, which ended up leaving me with a very anticlimactic, short level against a boss I'd already slaughtered later in the timeline as my personal final boss experience. I'll go into more detail why these suck during the story breakdown, and I'm so well practiced on these now it didn't take me any undue efforts as a veteran gamer. But make no mistake, these are amongst the hardest parts of the entire Lego Adaptation Games series, and I strongly suspect they didn't allow quite enough playtesting to get out the door in time for release. They also don't have a free play version, so no swapping vehicles and no skipping story cutscenes for you. Now, in order to best cover the story, I actually took the time to go and rewatch all of the Star Wars prequel trilogy here, too. I am very much of the opinion that any movie, no matter how bad, becomes fun in this formula. And let's be honest with ourselves, the Star Wars prequels do have some issues. I do also think they have some elements that are fun to jive with. Visual designs are often S tier. Several actors really bring a great screen presence to new characters like Liam Neeson's Qui-Gon or Samuel L's Mace. And I just adore Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I would like him to kiss me on the mouth. I already praised John Williams' soundtrack, and I'll do it again. Put that directly into my ear holes, please, and thank you. Watching the galaxy's democratic representation devolve fairly believably into fascism feels especially relevant, for whatever reason. Several elements work, and as long as you're not using it as a cover for toxicity, I do not mind that people love these. I was vibing with these. Though perhaps the alcohol had a little connection to the vibing. However, I don't vibe with the revisionist viewpoint that these are somehow secret, brilliant masterpieces. They commit every sin possible for a prequel to make, over-connecting unnecessary details and making the Star Wars universe feel so much smaller as a result. Some of the acting highlights everything that can go wrong with green screen sets and directorial failure to coax out better performances, which I'm sure the actors could deliver under different circumstances. I'll stand by this. Late aughts 3D animated Anakin is more convincing as Proto-Vader than live-action Anakin is in these. George Lucas needed fewer yes-men and bolder editors to polish up the things he genuinely does well. Some of the dialogue is so abysmal that I, a man who deliberately mangles grammar in his scripts sometimes just to be silly about it, cannot help but cringe. Sure, it's popular to hate Disney-era Star Wars nowadays, and some of that is certainly justified considering how soullessly the corporate whims made the franchise back down multiple times the literal moment they started to do something interesting or novel to hook my attention. But a new mess doesn't erase an old mess. It literally took The Rise of Skywalker,
somehow Palpatine returned,
just to edge out Attack of the Clones as my least favorite of these, and I'd still choose the first 2 of the sequel trilogy in a split second over that one. What makes the storytelling work so well in the game is that it gets several benefits of these movies. The bright colors and cool designs and swooshing action, and it practically removes the complaints since it shows the scenes faster and funnier and without the odd lines. Even being mostly dialogue free. I say mostly as battle droids still say, "Roger, Roger," and the first level technically plays Intruder Alert over the intercom. It's all very cohesive and understandable. I would know, as my dad actually wouldn't let me watch Revenge of the Sith at that age because it was PG-13 and I would have been disturbed. Which I concede, he was right, I was a sensitive child. But I still followed events without issue. Some of that is because there's a lot of storytelling coded into the visual language of the films, but mostly it's that there's scrolling paragraphs of context for every single level to fill in the blanks. Yeah, perhaps the non-verbal expertise people praise in these isn't necessarily doing the heavy lifting here. Story time. And full disclosure, I'm not going to highlight every single difference to the movies, that would take all day. I'm covering stuff I found interesting, but feel free to comment anything you like that I omitted. We start off with negotiations covering Qui-Gon Jinn and his apprentice Obi-Wan's attempted assassination by the Trade Federation. Personally, I think this is a great introductory level. It establishes gameplay mechanics and expectations rather well, with tons to interact with and infinite PK droids to harass and murder for no reason. It also does a good job capturing the general spirit of the scene despite having to change a good amount to actually be a fun level, which is a huge requirement for this entire game franchise. The events of the movie's version would be a harder sell if presented literally. Kids would probably get frustrated if the opening moments of their new game were spent pumping neurotoxins into the room like GLaDOS, and while there is some fun combat right away, there's also a lot of futile door cutting and fleeing droidicas and hiding unnoticed that would make for an anticlimactic gameplay experience. Here, the Jedi successfully fight all the way through the corridors to a much smaller hangar, with TC-14 joining the party instead of her original role of just being accessory to murder, and the droidicas ambush them there to serve as a mini-boss in spirit if not in function. As a kid, I was actually a little bit afraid, despite the lax consequences of death, to round that first corner, as it was my first combat experience in a game and I couldn't see where the enemies were. I was an odd kid. Invasion of Naboo covers the bits where everything is fleeing, the battle droids blazing through the swamp, and saving Jar Jar to join the party. This one can be a minor pain in the ass at first if you're trying to use the Force on all the flora only to get jumped over and over by platoons of droids, but it's nowhere near the guiltiest example of this in the game, so I'll reserve those comments for later. Much of the architecture is based on the sacred place the Gungans evacuate to later in the movie, which is a reasonable decision since there wasn't enough from that scene later on to justify a level. Fun fact, it takes a very long time to walk a gonk droid across this entire level. I'm entirely unsure why I did this too. Gunga City only appears in a cutscene, and the bit with the fishies is omitted entirely. Escape from Naboo starts with Obi-Wan struggling to get it up, before switching to just Queen Amidala and Captain Panaka in gameplay, which is justified as a way to mix up the gameplay for people to learn blaster characters, and also probably because the Jedi need a minute to fluff Obi-Wan before he's ready to go again. This level is very pretty. I love running around the pseudo-Italian architecture of the palace here, and by the second half, the Jedi have rejoined you to finish escaping to the hangar, which they enter via rooftop instead of waltzing in the door. There's even an area you can get to in free play, which is just a uniquely pink room with unique pink variants of the smashable thingies, and I found this place fascinating as a kid. It's clearly supposed to be the Queen's chambers, and fuck it, I'd live in the pink room. Now, if I'm being overly critical here, the playable cast is all wrong. Queen Amidala should technically be in her black garb instead of her more iconic red dress, and at that, should also be disguised as a handmaiden, as this should be the decoy Natalie Portman played by Keira Knightley here. Jar Jar is also nowhere to be seen, something that admittedly took me nearly 20 years to notice, which means he's only natively in the one level prior in the entire game. And technically there was a much larger group the Jedi rescued here, but I'll allow technical limitations to win that round. Finally, Panaka's hat is all wrong. It should have the droopy bit in the back. He's just lucky he's so cute that I'll let him get away with anything. His Lego minifigure is also cute. The order of operations for the middle chunk of the movie gets kind of wacky here. Their escape is flawless in the game, completely cutting the blockade, damaging the ship, and forcing them to make an emergency stop. So here they just land on Tatooine for no reason, and their hyperdrive generator just sort of does that, for no reason. Shmi is completely absent from the entire game, not for the reasons you might expect. She actually just had too much raw sexual energy with Qui-Gon. And even in Lego, it was just too clear they should absolutely be boning, and the whole thing would have gotten too M-rated too quickly. So most of the scenes on Tatooine are excised as well, cutting straight to the pod race to afford a new drive. And yeah, this one's pretty notorious. You absolutely have to stay ahead of your opponents at the end of each segment. Minikits and stud opportunities are quite easy to miss at these speeds. Hit detection with things like rocks and Tusken Raider gunfire is deceptively against your favor, and of course it makes you do 3 laps with a rapidly changing landscape in the second and third rounds. It's gonna suck for most people. I managed all minikits and True Jedi in my first playthrough this time, but that's only because I've had 20 years of practice. You'll be pretty good at any skill with 20 years of practice. Jesus, if I'd realized I'm bisexual 20 years ago, who knows where I'd be now? Probably not awkwardly hitting on Cap'n Panaka in a Lego video, I'll tell you that much. So the whole reason they fled Naboo was to get to Coruscant to try and get political support, and they only went back to do it themselves when that just wasn't going to be fast enough. But we don't actually see any of that happen here, so they just fly directly back to Naboo with their fixed hyperdrive. Those text scrolls are working overtime here. The Gungan battle is all relegated to a cutscene. Retake Theed Palace is an exciting, lengthy level with more of that pretty architecture, but this one was really fighting me here. Between crashes and the bug teleporting me back into the previous chamber, I had to make the tough call to speedrun to the end for progression, and just come back later for a True Jedi attempt, and then a separate minikit run in free play. Really dampened one of my favorite levels here. Anakin flies off to do all of his space stuff, also relegated to cutscene, though this was a level Traveler's Tales had done some work on before scrapping, and there are some pre-release builds floating around out there. The one I found and tried out was barely more than a corridor. Womp womp. Finally, Darth Maul. Weirdly, Padme is now just in her Tatooine outfit instead of the correct purple outfit she was wearing in the closing cutscene of the last level. Darth Maul himself didn't have a ton of screen time in the movie, but his little glimpses and his desert duel with Qui-Gon also didn't make it in, so here he just materializes from nowhere. For some reason, the force fields glitched before he got through them in the final corridor every time I played, so I kept having to hold the door open for him like a gentleman, except for the times I attacked him, which is much less gentlemanly. Qui-Gon dies for real in the cutscene despite resurrecting so easily in gameplay, raising terrifying questions about mortality in the Lego game universe, and they host the little victory parade, except most characters are just in the wrong outfits from earlier in the game, and Senator Sheev is nowhere to be seen. I'm starting to think they didn't respect the sanctity of the Phantom Menace. The end. Attack of the Clones cuts a metric ton from the early movie, jumping straight into Obi-Wan going to Kamino to find who tried to kill Padme in Discovery on Kamino. To be fair, the chase scene against Zam, the bounty hunter serving as middle manager in the memetically overcomplicated chain of dominoes that was this failed murder, was supposed to be the opening level, which got cut per time constraints and technical issues. However, without that scene, he just has a thingy and is going to a place. The rainy exterior and pristine white of the cloning facility make for very scenic locales, especially as you zigzag between both as you go. And this one has a fun bonus room with a disco remix of the Star Wars theme. But even still, I don't trust modern Disney to not come after my monetization now that they own everything, so I've replaced it with a less risky alternative.
Catch me on a block, slim, big car, 50 on a watch, make a white bitch crip walk.
For the first of several times in Attack of the Clones, instead of waffling back and forth between scenes an unnecessary amount of times to waste the entire first half of the story, Jango just immediately blows his guilt-ridden load so we can get right into the action. He has a series of drones, which are the only non-playable enemies in the game and do not appear in the movie, and a very memorable boss fight in the rain where Boba tries to shoot you with the ship which shall not be named apparently, and Jango fires missiles you have to throw back. Obi-Wan follows Jango to Geonosis, cutting their space battle, and calls Anakin and Padme, who have been flying around innocently and definitely haven't been getting to second base or genociding indigenous men, women, and even the children, no sir. But they watch him get captured and go to save him from the droid factory. Geonosians, quite to my delight, actually have a randomized opportunity to have either normal blasters or their sonic blasters, which come across rather goopy here. Side note, in one later free play level, I somehow had an entire group generate nothing but sonic blasters. Mathematicians, tell me what those odds are. This one's a fun setup, using the opportunity for moving components and death traps while toning down the excesses of the movie scene. The party stays together. Anakin's lightsaber isn't destroyed. C-3PO doesn't get randomly plugged into bad guy droids to raise terrifying implications of droid universality the series shall then fail to ever follow up upon again, and they even get all the way to finding Obi-Wan before they are overwhelmed and captured. Following, they are placed in the arena to get saved by Mace Windu for Jedi battle. This one's a massive deviation from the film, as they don't have to survive against any big monsters, and instead just get saved one by one as Mace fights normal droids and avoids mines, removing our main character's own impressive successes unarmed against grave peril, though admittedly, Mace Windu is a badass motherfucker and this should not be underappreciated. Anakin also has his green replacement saber for the rest of the story levels for this movie, though sadly doesn't get that as a free play variant. Now, there are a bunch of randomized generic Jedi fighting droids in the middle, including some with classic yellow minifigure coloring as a nod to the earlier sets, which I find quite charming. Jango tries to repeat his boss mechanics from before, but I tricked him into getting dismembered by a mine, which felt way more violent than his canon death by decapitation. The final cutscene also accidentally switches Obi-Wan and Anakin's lightsabers. The clones arrive to save the day, and they fly off for gunship cavalry. Personally, this one is considerably worse than pod racing, though I still did it in one go. See 20 years of practice. Cap'n Panaka, call me. This one is constantly scrolling forward, set at an angle, requires you to have expert timing to avoid lasers, you have to pick between individual paths with little turning back for minikits, all of which I had to do on keyboard arrow keys as a kid, as I didn't have a compatible controller, and that's only the first section. The second section sees you flying around in a circle to destroy one of their retreating sphere ship thingies, where you have to take out shield generators, then some sort of other generator, while dodging the lasers that fire in between each quadrant. Also, there's such a strict time limit counting down, you can barely do it all even playing correctly. God, this level really is the Attack of the Clones of this game. Finally, for Count Dooku, Obi-Wan and Anakin land to fight, of course, Darth Tyrannus. Isn't it really weird that we know him so much better as his lame normal name instead of Darth Tyrannus? What's up with that? This level has the infamous suicide minikit, which it clearly designed for an astromech to hover out and back for, but that's not how we play around these parts. Anakin gets taken down early on, sparing Obi-Wan's defeat to keep a player 2, and enter Yoda. We'll talk more about this flippy bastard when we're not already in the middle of a fight. His battle uses a lot of moves straight from the movie, throwing stuff from the walls at you, but he also turns into a little bitch and snipes you, the bullet is himself, if you try to collect studs or minikits. This is why you're going to want invincibility for free play. He escapes to meet up with Sheev, who is already grey despite not having been scarred by lightning yet. I can only conclude that he is in grey face, which certainly has to be racist in the Star Wars universe, what with all the aliens around, and thus I have a convenient rule of 3 opportunity to mock libertarians again. The end. Quick note on Revenge of the Sith, because Traveler's Tales didn't have access to the new music for the new movie at time of development, all of these levels use classic, pre-existing Star Wars scores, all of which are implemented so well I bet a lot of people didn't even notice, and even those who did likely won't care, since it's all just so pretty in my ear holes. The opening scene, Battle over Coruscant, is an on-rails spaceship battle as Obi-Wan and Anakin approach the ship that has kidnapped Chancellor Sheev. Interestingly, even though the whole scene was originally just Obi-Wan struggling, he's the one you play as here for player 1. This one is cinematic and cool, and genuinely one of my favorite vehicle levels in the whole series, really making up for those other two. Since the extended bit with the buzz droids doesn't come up in gameplay, Obi-Wan's starfighter is simply, inexplicably missing a wing during the end cutscene. Chancellor in Peril, if I may be so audacious, is actually an improvement over the movie scene in numerous ways just by virtue of having the characters make their way through the ship after Grievous on their own accord. Whereas the movie made the baffling choice to have painfully unfunny comic relief bits with the battle droids, and clumsily leading the cast through low-level Three Stooges antics. The Dooku boss fight in the middle sadly would not fall for my trickery to lead him near a bomb like Jango, though since Obi-Wan doesn't turn into an absolute jobber here, he gets to stay conscious through the next bits, making him weirdly cool with Anakin's execution of Dooku. Freeplay has a joke that was way too meta for me to get as a kid. Opening these doors, you naturally expect Lego bricks on the other side, but one of them inexplicably has a wall of normal masonry bricks. Credit is due, that's clever. There are several bits of running along the elevator shaft walls, or otherwise standing on surfaces that weren't originally supposed to be the floor, since gravity is fucky, ignoring the group's arbitrary recapture and immediate escape, before confronting Grievous's Magna Guards and crash landing what remains of the ship, where Mace Windu allows absolutely no time to rest or recuperate. This is clearly to keep the plot moving because there are a whole lot of talky bits in the flesh version that, again, won't fit this format. But I won't accuse this movie of waffling because they're an improvement on the whole from last time. Not that Attack of the Clones is a high bar to clear. That's like boasting about outsmarting my dog Azula, who is afraid of cars because she has unobservantly walked into a parked car on her own accord. Multiple times. Obi-Wan goes to General Grievous with Commander Cody, and this is about as vastly different as the game gets from the original scene. Instead of a populated cave thingy on the side of a steep canyon surrounded by separatist forces, he's just on an open platform in the middle of a much smaller canyon. There's no chase on a cool lizard fella against a giant unicycle, as the devs couldn't get that working. It's almost laughably short, with Greavy just jumping all over the place, and if you sequence break and destroy the bombs that are supposed to hurt him before he jumps to those areas, he just gets injured by nothing. Cody actually just fucking bites it in this version to give Obi-Wan a gun, providing a convenient explanation for him to avoid Order 66. We completely skip Mace Windu's fight with Sheev and Anakin's turn to the dark side. Nothing. Seems like a crucial omission. Meanwhile, over on Kashyyyk, we have Yoda and Chewbacca, later joined by Tarful, though the game refuses to call him his name, and every other Wookiee just looks the same. They all look the same to me, and I hate that. So, Yoda's an interesting playable character in this game. He's slow as fuck when walking normally, but turns into an unruly flipping menace with his lightsaber out, and it's not the most fun to play in either mode. He also has a third mode where you can jump up and hover around in his hover-round briefly used in Episode 2, which is a relief. Naturally, this is where Order 66 plays out and the clones turn against you, sadly lacking our missing scout troopers or any camo clones, replaced with normies and duplicate Codys. However, the battle droids are still running amok, and despite still being at war against the clones, both sides quit fighting each other to target a tiny green ketamine addict and the only man hairy enough to fulfill your mom's deepest desires. This literally happens as you're trying to cross a beach filled with mines, the enemies pour out nonstop, and the walkers start emerging too. This is too much, and crossing that beach is a pain in the ass. It's like the Vietnam War and the Normandy invasion had a horrific butt baby together, which really hates one specific frog and his favorite Sasquatchies. There's a nice Easter egg nod towards raising the X-Wing, except with an Episode 3 appropriate Arc 170, and some boulder dodging that feels accidentally prescient of Indiana Jones' own game down the line, and then Yoda rendezvous with Obi-Wan for Ruin of the Jedi. Sadly, the 501st Legion is nowhere to be found, simply using the same generic clones and duplicate Codys as the last level. Especially since the Swamp clone accidentally got blued here, it seems like a missed opportunity. However... And yes, I did overdo that so that editor me could slip a new audio file in here for a moment without anyone noticing. It's practically a seamless transition. The level does include the disguised clones. Clones who are pretending to be Jedi to trick survivors that show up, but they don't bother to cover their faces. And also, this version only works from the back. It's kind of a stupid scene. I understand why it got cut from the actual final movie. Child me was obsessed with these guys. I do not know why. This level does have them, is what I'm so elegantly trying to say here. They see footage of Anakin killing Shock T, confirming his turn to the dark side, which all happened apropos of nothing since we skipped the crucial bits. Interestingly, they accidentally stumbled upon the most canon version of Shock T's death they could have, years before it actually got confirmed as canon. See, she had several deleted scenes killing her off at different times throughout the movie, including one similar to this, which all got scrapped, making it impossible to distinguish any of these as canon just at time of development. Then, when The Force Unleashed was released in 2008, she survived Order 66 to live half naked in a weird jungle and get tentacle-vored to death, but of course that got decanonized in the Disney years, and it would take the return of the Clone Wars to imply this death happened here during this event. Lego Star Wars is the blueprint. We also skip Yoda's fight with Sheev. Not only is nobody really trying to do anything about the fascist who just seized power away from democratic representation in this world, also in Lego Star Wars, the video game, come to think of it, this means Yoda gives up even more pathetically easily here than his already moronic self-exiling in the original material. We do follow through to the climactic Darth Vader level to wrap up story mode. It does cut the spousal abuse. Choking your wife is exclusive to the Game Boy Advance, and though Obi-Wan and Anakin start fighting in the cutscene, they still have to co-op their way through most of the level. This one is intense, in a good way, with the collapsing hallway at first leading to a room with a timer. You can put up pillars to buy yourself more time to look around, but it's only ever just enough to keep you on your toes. There's a stretch of some of the most precise platforming in the game, even sending you back to the checkpoint instead of just letting you respawn if you hit the lava. And finally, what is still a unique novelty for the series, the final boss is Player 2. If you switch characters, Player 2 is still the final boss. It made me sad as a kid. I was a weird kid. Also, the AI turns into a freaking arcade Mortal Kombat match with how aggressively it abuses max CPU to kick your ass. It's actually quite easy to lose the final boss fight here. In the cutscene, Anakin briefly has a red lightsaber, something I vaguely think I remember seeing in a promo pic for the movie in a magazine in a bookstore in 2005, but couldn't find evidence for it online. But again, there's some amusing predictive power for modern Star Wars canon, as the modern version of red lightsabers come from bleeding the Kyber crystal inside by being a big enough hater. Lego Star Wars is the blueprint. Obi-Wan still chops him up like a roll of sushi, though. In the final story cutscene, Padme still gives birth, hopefully without the knowledge that her twins will someday make out, and fucking dies, which is even more illogical than in the movie, since she didn't even get choked here. Or perhaps less illogical, since the movie explicitly had a medical robot be like, "I can't figure out shit about her dying," and Sheev builds Darth Vader back, who throws his tantrum without a big melodramatic no, so it's kind of an improvement. The end. That bonus level, for A New Hope, lets Darth Vader and a stormtrooper slaughter their way through rebels in a way very similar to how Rogue One would eventually handle a similar scene. Lego Star Wars is the blueprint. But then, C-3PO willingly joins them and helps them through the rest of the ship. You traitorous bastard! One room sees Vader building the word Lego out of spare Lego, which seems to imply in-universe knowledge of that which they are made. Do they have self-awareness of their material reality? This raises questions. Did their ancient Lego Democritus speculate the tiniest possible atomic Lego bricks? Is the non-Lego environment just made up of smaller, more advanced Lego bricks in this universe? Do they perhaps even act like a fractal, eventually making up larger Lego bricks on the macro scale if you zoom out far enough? I'm not high, I swear there could be something to this. I'm gonna put a pin in that for future videos. Anyway, at the end, we see Leia put her secrets inside R2-D2 with a big "to be continued," and so, for real this time, the end. I had a blast revisiting both this game and 2/3 and some change of the 3 movies. It's not just the game turning 20 that's got me reeling with existential awareness. I'm actually turning 30 next month, and that just feels weird and wrong because I'm not a well-adjusted individual and the passage of time wigs me out. So I'm calling it quits for today, because damn it, I keep having fewer and fewer todays ahead of me. Oh god, I will die someday. Obviously, the next episode will cover LEGO Star Wars 2, so make sure to subscribe if you want to see that. Like, comment, and if you want to see your name in the patron credits like you're about to experience, you can do so for just $1 a month. This has been a briefish history of the LEGO Adaptation Games. I want to give a genuinely very special thanks to my patrons today. This is actually, as of recording this portion to add on to the end of the video, the 6th-month anniversary to the day of Hurricane Helene hitting and just devastating my home area, and I'm literally sitting here looking out my window and seeing how there are now just raging fires further into the county, making everything murky and smoky and, yet again, apocalyptic. So, what I'm trying to say is, things have been wild right now, and I feel very genuinely appreciated that you guys have supported this channel further.